Yeah, we'll get started here in just a minute, but I will encourage you Episcopalians to come forward, if you will. So everybody will start coming forward, grab a cup of coffee, come this way, and we'll get started in just a moment.
Promise. Oh, I don't have this on. I was going to say I promise I won't bite.
So click that on if you will.
Yes.
Yeah,
Got it. Hello. All right.
And gracious. So just Absolutely. It's good to see you. Good morning. I'm Richard Lawson, the Dean of St. John's Cathedral. I'm joined by Amanda Henderson, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture at Iliff School of Theology here in Denver. I'll introduce Amanda in just a moment. A warm welcome to everyone who's joining us via live stream as well. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for this morning, this chance to gather and to be with Amanda and to think deeply about these subjects of religion, politics, and culture. May your Spirit be with us, enlighten our minds, and finally reveal to us the kind of people you are always calling us to become, following the example of our Savior Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you on this gray fall morning in Colorado. And it's really great to welcome Amanda Henderson. Some of you will remember Amanda from her work with the Interfaith Alliance. For several years, she was the executive director of Interfaith, and we worked closely with Amanda when she was there at Interfaith. And she just recently transitioned to a new institute at Iliff. So please tell us about your work there and this new organization and what it is.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I've always been a fan of this congregation and the ways that the folks who are here live out their work, your call. So I'm grateful to be here. So as Richard said, my name is Amanda Henderson, and part of my story is that I'm also clergy in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and served in a congregation, South Broadway Christian Church over on Lincoln and Ellsworth for a couple of years before serving for almost 7 years at Interfaith Alliance of Colorado. So I begin with that because that planted the seeds for what is now the Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture at Iliff School of Theology. And so the founding and beginnings of this institute have kind of two tracks that converged. One is that Iliff School of Theology has a long history of engaging in social justice and being on the cutting edge of asking the big questions about who are we and where are we going and who do we want to be, and looking to scholars like Vincent Harding and Tink Tinker and Miguel de la Torre and Tony Alumcol, and incredible people who are there doing this kind of engaging work. So there were conversations happening at Iliff around how do we build this work that happens at Iliff and happens in theological education with new audiences or new learners and communities. How do we bring that outside of the building of the institute or the institution of higher education, right? These are conversations that are happening around higher education. So that was happening. And simultaneously, I was serving at the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado, where we brought people together from different religious traditions to engage in advocacy and education for progressive political issues. Specifically, we did a lot of work around LGBTQ rights and equality. We did work on reproductive rights, health and justice. We did work around homelessness and housing and economic inequality and criminal justice reform. And in that work, I worked oftentimes with legislators themselves, as well as with advocacy partners and coalitions. And one of the things that I noticed was that so often people have a very shallow understanding of religion. There are a lot of assumptions that we each hold about what religion is and how religion functions in our country, in our communities. And I often felt like people thought there were three primary stances of how people understand religion. One, it's irrelevant. It's in the past, it's an old way, it's dying, we're not even going to think about it. That's one way. The other is that it's toxic, and all we see is the way that religion divides people or is a source of anger and hatred and this real narrow understanding of religion as one form of American Christianity that has developed in the past 30 to 40 years as religion as a whole. The third way is that in a very transactional stance, similar to other, I would say, identity groups that wind up only getting attention during the election cycle. You'll hear those complaints and frustrations. For clergy and religious folks, the person running for office will go to the black church because they know they have power and get out the vote. They come every 4 years in about September or October. And for me as a clergy person, often I felt like, and this is I love the people that I worked with in advocacy spaces, but it was often, can you make sure you wear your collar and here's your talking points? And without being actually in relationship or being one of the thought partners in how we think about these issues. And so it was out of those experiences that I thought, what we really need is a way to think in deeper ways about the intersections of religion, politics, and culture, and to bring that information specifically to people who are serving in public leadership at multiple levels, whether it's state office, national office, city council, school boards, counties, community leaders, help them understand what religion is, and how religion is important in people's lives, and have some respect for that and understanding, as well as to be able to understand how religious ideas and frames shape so much of how we see ourselves and others. So that's the founding of the Institute, and we brought those two together with ILIF and with that goal in mind.
So this is really interesting. So, and we're for all of you, we're going to get to the subjects of politics and culture, okay? But I want to stay for a moment on this subject of religion, and I want to, and of course, it's all intertwined. But I want to stay on this subject, and I would love to hear your thoughts, Amanda, on. So let's just think for a minute. There are lots of theories among intellectuals, sociologists, and just any observer of religion in the West about how religion's doing. There are all kinds of theories. So just one theory goes like this. The West is becoming more secular. And it's usually tied to the numerical decline of institutions. Fair enough. Now what we would say in the Episcopal Church is you have overall decline, but there are pockets of tremendous growth, actually. For example, a lot of our larger Episcopal churches are actually growing pretty dramatically. So what you're seeing is an evolution in the Episcopal Church, not actually, superficially it looks like decline, but it's possibly not. Who knows? Second theory would be that religion can't go away because God doesn't go away and religious experience doesn't go away. It's just sort of going underground and changing dramatically. So a good example of that would be, how are we having such institutional decline when things like yoga on the one hand or mindfulness on the other are exploding? I mean, so does that mean religion's declining if you have this explosion of what are deep down religious practices? And then you get some other more nuanced approaches as well. Like there's an English theologian who says that what's really happening in England is, within and outside the church, is believing without belonging. So deep religious experience, but less church attendance, for example. So who knows? But it's fascinating. I know you all think about that. I mean, we all do. How could we not? As people who care deeply about experience of God and these bodies or institutions that are supposed to shepherd all of that. What's your take?
Ooh, so I think that's right, that this is a question
And
that's
anything
being asked
you would
a
add,
lot.
I'm sure I sketched that pretty quickly, so
Yeah.
feel free to, I'm sure you see
Absolutely.
it differently.
Well, I'm going to add a question before the question.
Sure.
So I think that one of the underlying assumptions to that question is that we can define religion. And I should mention also that I'm doing PhD work at ILF and DU, and I'm about to start my dissertation phase. So I've gotten to spend a lot of time with, like, oh, yeah, that's right. Like, how do we even define what is religion? And so when we say that religion is in decline, what is it that we are saying is declining? And so one of the important things to step back is to think about that the way that we understand religion in 21st century United States of America is a very particular understanding of religion that is also pretty new way of understanding religion in the scheme of time, which the way that we understand religion now is very much tied up in Western colonial religion that came to this land through the Catholic Church's first explorations to the New World, right? And then at the same time, the Reformation was happening. So the way that we understand church and religion at large, even the ways that we differentiate the world religions, is very much a construct of our modern world and perspective. So stepping back to that is like this, okay. I mean, it doesn't change the importance of our facts on the ground right now and the statistics that we're looking at, but it does, I think, kind of give this, okay, what are we actually talking about here?
May I just add one thing very quickly
Yeah.
to that? I think that's fascinating. I want to hear you say a lot more too. The way I've thought about it is, so every human culture imaginable has always had to bury their dead. And even if there were no religious institutions, if you could somehow just, they're all gone, we're still going to have to bury our dead. And there's going to be a pause for some people when they do that. A moment of reflection, a moment of grief, a moment of whatever. And that pause, when it happens, I mean, that's a religious experience. So I love what you're saying. We've got to look really carefully at how we define what is religious.
Yeah.
Is that a part of what you're...
That is a part of it. And I mean, if you look at like the sociology of religion, which Professor Alumkal studies, you'll see that there are lots of ways that we think about and talk about beliefs, rituals, systems of how we organize ourselves, how we draw our lines of inclusion and exclusion. But a lot of those ideas were developed by white Western Christian scholars and thinkers and explorers who were going and looking at the other and what was deemed religious and what was deemed not religious was tied up in power and politics and economics and land. And so there is always, when we say what is religious and what is not religious, it's always tied up in power structures. And naming also that race was directly tied up in that at the beginning as well. And if you look to the doctrine of discovery in 1493, that was the papal bull that was used to justify and give a license, basically, for the explorers to enslave, oppress, kill those they encountered based on what? Based on were they civilized and were they Christian? And if they weren't civilized and they weren't Christian, then they weren't human. And so you could do with them what you will until they, in theory, convert or become civilized. And then they had to figure out, okay, what's the next marker? And that, if you look at the history of the developments of race, it was very much tied up in those same things. And so even today, so bringing this back to today, so if we understand that there's just understanding the question of what is religious and what is not religious is always tied up in power, politics, race, all of those things. Then now a lot of scholars talk about the way that we think about secularism as being without religion or excluding religion is actually similar to the ways that we think of like post-racial identities. Like we can take away our racial identities and be post-race, right? And so secularism, and so we're gonna, this is complicated. This doesn't mean that there's some opposite that's an easy answer. Right. This means that when we say something is secular, what are we saying? Yeah. That it's without religion? Is that really actually, whose religion? Yeah. And how can you be without religion? And this comes into play a lot in international politics and in politics when one group is deemed religious and another is deemed secular. So
we need to have Amanda back for one whole class just on the expression, I'm spiritual but not religious. Just one whole class on just that and many other things. No, it is absolutely fascinating.
So to take that, I mean, you named people going to yoga or meditation. And I'll personally, this was my first, so I didn't grow up necessarily religious. I grew up in a very Christian culture, but not in I didn't have a church. My grandparents were Baptist. I actually went to high school in Colorado Springs, home of Focus on the Family and very conservative Christian politics. I thought that's all there was. But I always...
No wonder you're doing a PhD.
There's always a story, right? My in-laws worked at Focus on the Family and are still very much in that camp. This is personal. And I've seen it on the ground. And I've seen the ways that, wait a minute. And honestly, it was those experiences that made me ask the questions that I continue to ask, which are, how do the ways that we understand God, find meaning, impact the way we live our life and the way we treat one another at the most basic sense. And so in the institutional church changes, I am more in the camp of evolving than I am. Absolutely, institutions are changing. These institutions that we thought, some of us, were going to live in perpetuity, they were built to last forever. And honestly, that's a theological perspective, that anything lasts forever. Because I don't know about you, but I don't know any single thing that lasts forever. I don't care what it is. And so, why do we think that something's going to last forever? That's theological, our understanding of God as never changing. So institutions as we know them were built by us and will change. Our connection to that which is beyond, for me, what I would name my own experience of God and spirituality and my experience of Christianity, that lives and moves just like the Spirit. That's not contained to an institution or a building. That lives between you and me and within you. So how people are finding that spiritual connection is something that's interesting to me. And I think that the role of church, but part of it would be great to ask, what was the role of church? And what is the role of church institutions? Because there's such value in community and learning and caring for one another. And what is the heart of the institution that we want to live on, even if we acknowledge, our buildings and our money and our in perpetuity-ness is going to change.
Yeah, that's a whole nother class too, isn't it? And this is what you hear in the Episcopal Church at our best, and we are far from our best, but that it's a living tradition, and the tradition is most traditional when it's changing, which is just a paradox and fascinating. And tradition also means, it actually has an image attached to it in the original language. Tradition is something that's passed, and I actually really like that because it means it gets our fingerprints all over it, and it's reshaped. Anything like bread is reshaped in the passing, too. So fascinating. Tell us about this word culture, though.
Yeah.
I don't know that we're ever going to get to the topic of politics, though, at this rate. But
Oh,
this
yeah,
is fun.
we will. Right here, right now.
So tell us about culture.
Okay, I'll tell you about culture, and I'm going to tell you that culture is tied up in politics, and politics is tied up in culture, and culture and politics are tied up in religion. And so that is, when I think about culture, politics, and religion, I think about that these are different ways that we are moving and changing together. And again, this could also be a contested term. Like anthropologists will say, what is culture? And we could have the same conversation about what is religion. So all the terms are contested. But when I think about culture change, I think about the ways that our norms, how we understand, what we understand as this just is the way it is. You know, how many times do you hear someone say that? Like, this is just the way it is. Yeah. Well, is it? Culture changes. And what we think is normal changes. What we wear, that I'm wearing pants, that I'm a woman up here. These are all aspects of culture. And one of the things I love about culture is identifying the places where there's that edge, where like the boundaries are being pushed. And I see that a lot in art, music, poetry, plays, like that's what I love. But culture's all around us. We're absorbed in culture, but naming specifically those places that are kind of like challenging, bumping up against our culture. And when we think about social change, for example, thinking of the LGBTQ rights movement. 25 years ago, how many of us thought, okay, it's fine. Homosexuality is not a sin. It is a normal part of our society. If you look at the statistics, that the measure on where people stand on that question has changed a lot. And I would argue that it's changed because of all three, religion, politics, and culture. Our culture, I watch, there's so many shows now on TV where you see two men kissing, two women together. You see commercials with families of all different kinds. That also was not, that would have been like, 20, 30 years ago. And politics slowly has shifted from, changing it to where homosexuality was not a crime. Some places are still wrestling with that. To actual inclusion on marriage, to anti-discrimination laws, to health benefits, and expanding our political way of understanding it. And then religiously, I know that the Episcopal Church has wrestled with and evolved over time on how people understand sexuality and gender. And, my kids have very different upbringing around sexuality and gender than I did in Colorado Springs in the 90s. And just assumptions about like what's okay and what's not okay. So, and part of that is reinforced through our religion, having clergy who are standing up there saying love is love, and God, all people are created in the image of God, and the Bible only has a few verses that aren't actually about this. So they're intertwined and connected. So when we're trying to actually build change, we need to be paying attention to all three.
So this is interesting too. So I gave Amanda a whole set of questions, and I basically haven't asked any of them.
It's fine.
And so I just want to interject really quickly. I think that's really interesting too. I remember, so some of you will remember this. So Gene Robinson, openly gay bishop in a marriage, was it wasn't a marriage then because that was not legal, was consecrated as the Bishop of New Hampshire in 2003. I was a curate at a parish in the Diocese of Alabama, and I vividly remember then and even now how superficial and misleading the labels were that we put on things, especially in relation to human sexuality. For example, it drove me up a wall because I was progressive in this little Alabama parish on the issue. As my dad put it, I'd been trained in seminary in New York, so that had ruined me. What I remember thinking that was so misleading is gay and lesbian Christians in the Episcopal Church who are pushing for the sacrament of marriage, that actually is so freaking traditional. They want to be married. Like, so just think about it for a minute. They actually want the sacrament of marriage in the Book of Common Prayer with lifelong vows, just switch the pronouns around. And so it sort of drove me up a wall that it just was such a, it's not progressives versus traditionalists, actually. It honestly is, I don't even know. I can't even think of the right labels, but I know that's not what the label is. And that just leads to a follow-up question. These labels, too, and we're going to get into this, getting into politics, these labels of liberal, conservative, progressive, moderate, whatever, they're misleading, too.
Always, yeah.
Tell us about that, please.
Whew. They're always misleading and more complicated than they seem. And actually, I think that the question of labels and identity, whether used around race, religion, politics, I don't think we're there. I don't think we understand how to deal with them yet. And gender and sexuality. And my dream is that we find a way that both honors all of those layers of identity that we each are wrapped up in a knot in, that honors those particular unique identities, and which holds a universal connection to the fact that we are all tied up in each other, that the way I live impacts the way you live, and your choices impact me. We are all shaping each other, and we are each unique. And so I think that sometimes, one example of this, I have 3 kids who are 20, 18, and 16. And one, they've grown up in the heart of COVID being during those years has been really challenging. But also there's this big shift in how they understand gender and sexuality and labels. And, you hear this political argument right now, and here I go into politics, but one of the candidates for governor made a comment that kids are naming themselves as a cat and asking for litter box. It's just kind of absurdity, right? That it's taken to this extreme, rather than just naming, that teenagers and children are figuring out who they are, and that's going to change over time. And who didn't change between 9 and 18? Raise your hand. We're all changing, and our identity is a part of that. And so there's this tendency on more liberal and more conservative sides at the extremes. The whole thing about cancel culture, I think, is funny because both extremes have cancel culture. It's not just one or the other. And I think cancel culture is a problem. That's saying if you're not with me, then you're against me. That's always problematic. And if you're not this, then you're that. Who among us is not changing? And so we keep coming back to that change question. So when it comes to the complexity, I think we just don't allow much room for the nuance and the change that we are all tied up in.
So I want to let's go back to your Institute for Politics, Religion, and Culture. So I would say here, let me talk just for a moment about the cathedral. When I think about all life is politics, but when I think about, say, doing an advocacy statement or the work of the Faith in Action Commission, which tries to get people more and more involved from the parish with nonprofits and justice work, when I think about all of that work, almost always, I don't find the labels helpful. So progressive conservative is, frankly, I don't know that I've even said it from a pulpit, and I doubt I will. And I always think about when I'm writing something, I try to speak to people of goodwill across the political spectrum at St. John's Cathedral. And that's me. And I also know that St. John's, by all the labels, I mean, my dad would say this is a pretty progressive place, and it is on some issues. But I try to speak to goodwill across that spectrum, because the cathedral, whether it's Christmas Eve or this morning, really engages with a variety of political views. What about the Institute? Do you think about that? Are you more of an organization, because I know organizations that don't think that way, and for good reasons. They're trying to build a community of support and precision that needs a lot of coherence to do the work. Where are you on that map?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think one that so many wrestle with. And in starting this institute, the first thing I did was spend a full year doing a landscape analysis of all of the work happening at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture nationally, and kind of the different approaches that some people take. And there are organizations and institutions that are grounded in faith-rooted advocacy, right? We know those in town. That's what the bucket that Interfaith Alliance of Colorado was in. Here we have Together Colorado, Faith in Action. There are different, and more conservative, more liberal, across the spectrum. There are organizations, that's what they do. There are other organizations that are more think tank, and so they are really engaging from a more political science perspective, sociology of religion perspective. And then there are organizations that have a very much more academic path, that they're arguing about terms like secular and looking at the ways that impacts our international politics. So looking at the different ways, one of the things that I think is hard is that a lot of times organizations say, well, we're not going to be political, and so we're going to just look from like an external objective viewpoint. And we have learned over time that that's just not possible, right? We all have a viewpoint. And we all come from somewhere. So I'd rather be aware of the viewpoint, the context, the situation, and for us at the Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture, aligned with the long history of ILIF, we are taking a stand around what we are for and what we think is wrong and how we base that. Something like unlimited access to guns. I don't know who would have a human-centered, God-oriented perspective that would be for unlimited access to a weapon of mass destruction and killing. So there are things that ILIF has a history of standing out on: civil rights movement, racial justice issues, LGBTQ rights and equality. ILIF has a long history of speaking on that, abortion rights and reproductive rights. So it's pretty easy for us to, that all sounds like a political platform, right? So I don't mean to say that in a political platform or a party alignment, but the roots of our stance on those issues comes from our values rooted in liberation and freedom, in our inherent interconnection and impact on one another, and our commitment to building and supporting leaders and communities that are working for justice, liberation, freedom, equality. All those are loaded terms that we could sit and debate, right? So I'm just naming that we are more in the position of we are working on these issues, and we're doing that boldly. I would say the posture that I get really excited about and think that we need to spend more time on is imagination. And thinking about what a world looks like. I want us to pull in we have the prophet who says, tear this all down, it's corrupt. We also have the prophets who cast a vision of the world that could be. And so often, especially in progressive politics, we are really good at saying what's wrong and not really good at casting a vision of what it looks like to create communities where all people are valued and honored with the complexity of their real identities, and that assures that we have places where all people can thrive and live with freedom and relationships and interconnection and interdependence. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
No, I think it does. So let's focus on midterm elections. Is your organization doing much work as we approach November 8th?
So we just held a couple weeks ago a candidate forum, and we did this candidate forum in collaboration with the Institute and then the Women's Alliance at ILIF, which is a group of women, as they identify themselves, who are helping support the work of ILIF. So the two of us came together. We did a Women in Leadership candidate forum and really saw it as an opportunity to educate, to help people become engaged and learn. We invited candidates from all major parties who are running for office in Colorado who identify themselves as women. And so we did not get any Republican candidates in full transparency, but we did invite Heidi Ganal, Pam Anderson, and the other two state-level women candidates. There aren't as many women candidates in the Republican Party, but we had a great lineup and great conversation. And so part of our role, too, is I actually was at a candidate forum last week at DU with the governor and different folks. We had a very different forum than they did. Theirs was great. But we asked questions that were more about their own story and how it informs their political perspectives, about their experiences and what they care about the most. So our way, when we're talking about the midterm elections, is we're always there, building relationships, making connections. I think that is one key, is having that human relationship with people who are in different offices. Actually, at that forum, I got to meet the whole Centennial City Council was sitting right behind me. And so afterwards, we had a great conversation. Our hope is to be building those connections and then helping them think about these topics in different ways. So it's less, we're a C3 organization, for those who know tax code. We aren't taking, supporting particular parties or candidates, but we are speaking out and both working for liberation and freedom policies, as well as asking the questions from a different angle.
I get a little bit tickled hearing you say that because I love it so much. In the church, we love discernment language. And if you're going to be an EFM, Education for Ministry, or if you're going to go through the discernment process to be a priest or a deacon or a bishop, you're going to get asked about your spiritual journey. And wouldn't it be great if we asked every political candidate to tell us about their spiritual journey? Tell us about, who are you? How'd you get... President Trump, how'd you get to this point? What were your experiences? You know what I'm saying? President Biden, tell us a little about your childhood, But that's so. And
what's interesting is I think that we're afraid to ask that question because of the separation of church and state, which I'm all for, assuring that we aren't institutionalizing any particular religious doctrine or ideology into our politics. But the myth in that is that our religious and spiritual self can be put on a shelf when we walk into a political space. And that's just not possible. And so are there ways to acknowledge, this is our whole person? And this is why it's kind of challenging, too, the language of secularism, similar to, can you put your gender on a shelf when you walk into a room? Can you put your race on a shelf when you walk into a room? No. Can you put your religion on a shelf? No. So then we have to ask bigger questions. By acknowledging that that's not possible, it's not resigning to the fact that that's all we are. I'm not just a religious or spiritual person. It's a part of me. And if we acknowledge that, then we actually have to get to know the other people.
So I thought of another class that you got to come back and do. And then we're about to open up for Q&A. There was, I don't know if many of you remember this, but there was, when Rowan Williams was Archbishop of Canterbury, he made a statement in the press, and he just got vilified, but it was about the way law functions in England, and here's the tie-in. There's been a dramatic increase in the last few decades of Muslims in England. And Rowan Williams, who's brilliant, made a comment that Western law actually should take into context, just think about it before you make a decision of how Sharia law functions within Muslim society. And he got vilified, but here's why all this relates. Like, we as Westerners only think in terms of individuals. You are purged from your family, from your culture, from your religion when you step forward in front of that judge. And it's just how most of us probably in this room think. That's an unusual, in the history of human culture, that's actually an unusual way of thinking. It's a very post-Enlightenment Western way of dividing people into an individual unit that then gets applied, rewards and punishments. So all of this, you're opening up just a profound way of seeing all of reality. So I thank you for it, and I do hope you'll come back. Right before we open it up for Q&A, and we've got enough time for questions, just tell us, there's a lot of pain and grief and confusion in the world, and I think just a ton of compounding that we're all going through in various sorts of ways. Where do you find... I know you feel it, and where do you find just some measure of hope? What gets you, out of bed in the mornings to keep going?
Yeah. So two things. One, I of course have to name hope beyond hope. So hope isn't something that is for a desired outcome, but it's a hope in spite of it all, and a no matter what. That, to me, that's hope. And that's different than, I hope I'm going to get a pony. That'd be nice to have a pony, but if I don't get a pony, I'm still going to be fine. And so holding that. But what gives me that feeling of we're going to be okay, whatever that looks like, is last week was Gathering Days at ILIF, which means that students from all over the country and some international students come for the week who are a part of the hybrid course structure and the Journey program, so they live in different places. And I got to teach, I've been teaching my own first class on my own, which has been really
great.
fun. Yeah. And so it was the first time that our whole class was together, in person, and hearing their stories and knowing that these people are, one, taking the time to continue to learn and grow and ask big questions. That gives me hope. Over the weekend, my oldest daughter's at CU Boulder. She's a junior, and we had our first parents' weekend experience. Because of COVID, we hadn't gotten the full experience, which it is an experience. And CU, I'm a CSU grad, but I still had to cheer for CU since we're paying for her tuition. And they won their first football game yesterday, so they might not be the worst team in the country anymore. I don't know. I don't really track or pay attention. But
you've gotten really far afield on this one.
I've gotten really far. Sorry.
No, I love it. Trust me, I love it.
This is where my brain goes, so sorry about that. But getting to know my daughter's friends. She's 20. She's amazing. Not to brag on my daughter, but I will brag on my daughter. Seeing, and then I have a 16-year-old son who last night exploded in different ways. So I get to see the real angst as well as, okay, they're okay and smart, and the conversation among these young people and the ways that they are both enjoying life and facing the big, hard problems, asking them what they're working on in school and walking around campus and knowing, there are bioethicists at work learning and taking these classes and thinking about how to solve our biggest problems in the world. Those things, and knowing that that's happening all over the world. Yeah. And that so often all we hear is the tragedy and the drama, and that's all real. I'm not saying ignore that. I think we also need to pay attention to the pain, obviously. And knowing that there are people tilling the soil, planting seeds, nurturing communities, nurturing each other figuring things out when they're hard. That is what gives me hope.
Great answer. Well, let's open up for questions. I think Pete's going to come around with a microphone. If you'll raise your hand, and even if one person's asking a question, if you'll go ahead and raise your hand so that Pete and I can see that another one's coming.
Thank you so much. This is so interesting. I'm curious your thoughts on the interplay of technology as well. Because the world we're in today is so interconnected. My own brain, I'm a history major, looks back to the evolution of the printing press and what that did to society, religion, politics. But today, where we're seeing news not just from our town or our city, but from the entire world, that we have connection immediately through social media, through everything. I'm curious your thoughts.
A great question. And ironically, that was our lesson this week in the class I'm teaching, is because it's actually more like functional, practical class about nonprofit leadership. And we're talking about the role of technology in leadership today. And then I also had conversations with my kids over the past couple days about TikTok. My daughter was saying there's some TikTok channel that she loves because it's so informative, and the ways they get their information is so different. And I think that we have to be careful of the binary way of understanding technology as either good or bad, or this thing that could free us up to have so much more time. It's going to make everything easier and more efficient. We all know that's not true. Or that it is evil and I'm going to avoid all use of technology. Good luck. How are you going to talk to your children or grandchildren? Or, it's a very, I think that we don't know yet, but I suspect that, like anything else, that there are ways that technology can be a real gift and a tool for making us aware of our interconnectedness, for supporting, nurturing, caring, expanding freedom, all of those things. And I don't mean to framing this as a good or evil, but it might be coming out that way. There can be ways we can use it to support our ultimate vision and goals and what we imagine for ourselves and each other. And there can be ways, my 16-year-old son wasn't invited to go with his friends yesterday, and he spent most of the day looking at how much fun they were having, and that he wasn't a part of that, and was so enraged by the end of the day. And so, I told you it was that's a normal day for me. Oh, this is amazing. Oh my gosh, the world is going up in flames. And so there is this but helping him navigate, and this is where it's hard with young people, because you're trying to help them navigate. It really helps young people feel connected. A lot of them feel a sense of belonging because of their relationship with technology and the ways that they can communicate all the time and find other people who are more like them. But it also can further those pain points that are within us, the doubts, the FOMO, fear of missing out, the addictions, so it's not so simple. Of course, that's the answer, is that it's not simple. We don't know what the long-term impacts are going to be. And I agree that it is as transformative as the printing press, in that historically we'll be able to look back and go, okay, this was a fundamental shift in how we understand ourselves. And at iLift, we have an artificial intelligence and ethics project that's happening, and institute working with people in Silicon Valley who are building ethical AI and helping ask the questions, like when we're talking about in politics, they're asking those to the people who are developing technology, to make sure that the technology that we're building doesn't reinforce the racism, power structures that we have institutionalized in our institutions.
Yes, very interesting what you're talking about. A couple times you have mentioned liberation. Could you expound on that, please?
Yeah, he asked, is there, that I have mentioned liberation a couple times, and can I expand on that? So it's a good question, just like any of these terms, right? So when I talk about liberation, I mean the shift from a place of bondage or oppression to a place of freedom and determination, self, or community. And for me, that's a part of being free. It's not in the individual sense that I'm free to do whatever I want. Liberation and freedom is also connected to this responsibility and accountability to one another in ways that are different than hierarchical, oppressive systems. So liberation is a new way of understanding and living into ourselves and our communities that are rooted in freedom and the well-being of one another and the community. Does that help? Again, we could probably do a class.
So thank you so much for coming. I think in the last 45 minutes, you have asked more questions of us than we have answered for ourselves. So I'm wondering, will you come back and talk to us more? Or do we need to come to ILIF to have these discussions? So,
great question. I'm still figuring that out, like how, and we're still figuring that out at ILIF, quite honestly, like how to support like deeper thinking and questions around these topics. And that's part of realizing that there is a real need and hunger in the community, in our society, for asking deeper questions and really like thinking about things in more complicated ways. My favorite scholar is Hannah Arendt, who is a Jewish woman who grew up in Germany and was a scholar during the Holocaust and wound up having to flee. And one of her favorite lines that she says that I love is that it's easier to act than it is to think. And we are caught in a society where we just act. And so creating more spaces where we can think. So we do have a new podcast called Complexified. And I brought little cards. It's on all your podcast things. And there's a little scan. You can scan it like you would at a menu at a restaurant. And so we are engaging in these kinds of questions on Complexified. We just finished our first season and we're rebooting to jump into our second season here, where we're going to be talking all about bodies and abortion and different ways that we think about and legislate and live in bodies. So that's one place, but I do, we'll be back in touch about more ways to be able to continue. Okay.
So there are several things that have been said that made me think about this. One was at the very beginning of whether or not religion is declining in the West and the reference to yoga and mindfulness. But then also the comment about Ronan Williams' comment about Sharia law and the connection of a community and a family. So it seems to me that Christianity is more disembodied than most of the other major religions, certainly more so than the other Abrahamic religions. When I think about Judaism and Islam, they are very connected to a specific part of land. They have a lot of dietary rules, laws, practices, rituals. They're more connected seasonally in their celebrations than Christianity is. And it seems to me that part of the decline of institutional Christianity and for what's going on with young people is this disembodied nature of Christianity that's not as connected to the land and not as connected to the experience of bodies with the land and to each other. Can you comment on that? Does that seem to be the case to you? And if so, how are you looking at that?
Yeah, such an interesting question. I really appreciate it. So first I would say acknowledge that has been my experience, especially doing interfaith work, that a lot of what has been built into how we understand Christianity today compared to how specifically Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu tradition, Sikh, experience and practice their religion, that each of those are a lot more body, land, food focused than Christianity, that in Western American Christianity in the 21st century, it's, do you believe in Jesus? Like, okay, now what? And that there is this element that we are more focused on the written word, the spoken word, and the intellectual enlightenment value set that is more focused on what we think than who we are and what we do and how we live together. So I see that. The irony to me is that as Christians, who do we follow? Who do we follow? Jesus. The Sunday school question. Who do we follow? We follow Jesus. Who is Jesus? God incarnate. God in bodily form. God who came and washed people's feet and ate with them and held them and touched them. And so the irony is thick. And so I guess that's where I want to also challenge us to think about, like, what is Christianity? What is religion? What is in decline? What is changing? Are we actually just experiencing a decline of something that we had built that is built up that doesn't maybe fully capture the Spirit of God expressed through Christianity?
Thank you so much for your questions, for your participation. Again, God bless everyone joining us online. Please do join us, if you feel so called, to the service of Eucharist at this same place, sjcathedral.org, at 10:30 a.m. And last but certainly not least, Amanda, you complimented professors at Boulder, and just know you're one of our great teachers too. We're really grateful and can't wait to have you back again. Much, much thanks.